Hey everyone, this is a piece titled Materialism and Dialectics by Stefano Breda. By Stefano Breda. This is from the book Marx Key Concepts, edited by Riccardo Bellofiore and Tomasso Redolfi Riva. I'm just reading miscellaneous entries from this book. But this one's titled Materialism and Dialectics. So section 1 is titled A Theoretical Tension Field. If one had to choose two unavoidable keywords to characterize Karl Marx's philosophy, these would probably be, quote, materialism and, quote, dialectics. The two terms even came to be merged together in the official philosophical doctrine of Marxism-Leninism, the diamat, which stands for dialectical materialism. In 1974, Cesare Luporini pointed out that the terms, quote, dialectics and, quote, materialism are not immediately in harmony with each other. Cesare Luporini lived from 1909 to 1993 and was an Italian philosopher, historian of philosophy, and politician. He's a member of the Italian Communist Party. Anyway, back to the text. The significance of materialism and dialectics connection cannot be taken for granted, since as such, it defines just a, quote, theoretical tension field, end quote, Luporini, 1974, in which the more precise meaning of this connection still has to be sought. A large part of philosophical Marxism can be seen as work within this tension field, work that produces an incredible multiplicity of methodological and epistemological positions, each with different theoretical and even political consequences. Since the 1960s, with the development of heterodox currents in Marxism, scholars belonging to different schools have highlighted the limits of dialectical materialism, which, as a philosophical doctrine with a claim to universality, tends to translate into an all-encompassing and super-historical Marxist worldview. Although such a doctrine can find support in the philosophical reflection of Friedrich Engels, it is hardly compatible with Marx's insight into philosophy, its limits, and its relation to the empirical world. Having rejected the orthodoxy of dialectical materialism, heterodox Marxist scholars have more often focused on the notion of, quote, materialist dialectics, end quote, as a philosophical method used by Marx in his critique of political economy. At the time of writing in 2021, however, we are still a long way from giving the term, quote, materialist dialectics, end quote, a reasonably agreed and unambiguous meaning. The question of the specificity of the dialectical method followed by Marx in his critique of political economy with respect to an idealist dialectics has been at the center of heated debate since the first publication of Capital Volume 1. The inconsistency of the famous metaphor of inversion through which Marx defined the relationship between Marx's dialectical method and that of Hegel was convincingly highlighted by Louis Althusser in 1965, who, however, did not provide any real comprehensive alternative. More concrete indications can be found in some fundamental intuitions of Theodor W. Adorno and in their elaboration by the Neue Marx-Lektura, the new reading of Marx developed in Germany since the 1960s. If we follow these inclinations, Marx's revolution of dialectics does not consist in an inversion of subject and predicate with respect to its Hegelian form, but rather in the recognition that dialectics tout court is merely the philosophical expression of those specific social relations in which subject and predicate are objectively inverted, capitalist relations. See Reichelt, 1970 and 1972, Coletti, 1969. If then dialectics in dialectics Hegelian form presents an upside-down world, we do not bring it down to earth by overturning it as a system of thought, but by revealing its objective roots in capitalist relations and criticizing an inversion operating in these relations. At most, then, it is the material relations that are to be overturned, not the dialectics. Rather, dialectics is to be denaturalized, demystified by identifying dialectics' historically determined presuppositions. Much more appropriate than any image of inversion is therefore an image of delimitation. Quote, the dialectical form of exposition is only correct if it knows its limits, end quote. Marx, 1858/61. That is, the points at which the dialectics from explanans becomes itself part of the explanandum as a historical product in need of an equally historic explanation. All this, however, remains only an abstract general conception of dialectics until a satisfactory answer has been given to the fundamental problem raised by Althusser. To demystify dialectics means not only to think of dialectics in different terms, but also at the same time to transform dialectics' operative principles. Now, if the demystification of dialectics corresponds to dialectics' limitation, the problem arises in these terms. What does it mean operationally to use the dialectical form of exposition, knowing the dialectical form of exposition's limits? Here I want to argue that in order to answer this question, it is necessary to overcome some basic limitations of the meta-theoretical proposals of the Neue Marx-Lektura, whose conception of dialectics remains too much in line with the Hegelian project of absolute knowledge. Since it is a question of working within what Luperini calls the quote the quote theoretical tension field, end quote, generated by the juxtaposition of the two poles, quote dialectics and quote materialism, it is necessary to find the coordinates of this tension field first. In order to do so, it is useful to ask what, according to Marx's methodological self-understanding, characterizes his procedure as dialectical and what marks its distance from an idealistic procedure. Starting from the second point, the oppositional lines shown in Table 2.1 can be extrapolated from Marx's statements. Okay, so there's a table here, and I'll try to explain it. The differences between materialistic and idealistic dialectics in Marx's self-understanding. So he has like on one side it says, on the left, I guess it has Marx. I don't know. On the left side, it says, I guess it has the materialistic one side and the I don't know. So for Marx, I guess it would be, or like the materialistic dialectics would be unfolding of the quote peculiar logic of the particular object, end quote, Marx, instead of the application of a ready-made logic to a specific object. See Marx and Engels, 1856-59. And an a posteriori reconstruction of this logic, an appropriation of the concrete, quote, as a concrete in thought, als ein geistig Konkretes, end quote, Marx, 1859, versus an, quote, a priori construction, end quote. A reconstruction of the, quote, process of formation of the concrete itself, end quote. So one of the things that I notice here, maybe this is something I'm not terribly, expertise on dialectics, but for my, I was an undergraduate philosophy student, but the materialist dialectics is way more empirical, right? The peculiar logic of a peculiar object, right, seems very like not a metaphysical conception about the nature of things as such, but the nature of a particular object that is not a necessary constituent part of existence as such, right? Like, it's not talking about dialectics as like the nature of like a transhistorical universe, right? And this other part, a posteriori, if you note the word a posteriori means, it's a very important philosophical term, but also it can be used in definitions. But that means it's an empirical question, right? It means that a posteriori means like post experiential, right? Based upon um, uh, recorded what can be known from studying a thing in nature, not in nature, like in the you know colloquial sense, but like the study of like actually existing things using senses, right? And a priori construction, a priori is fundamentally metaphysical in nature, right? A priori means when you construct something a priori, you're doing kind of like a logical game of like consistent definitions or something like that, right? So when you do an a priori construction, um, an example of a great example of an a priori construction would be like Descartes' "I think, therefore I am." Right? It's not like he goes out and does a scientific experiment or something, right? It doesn't do empirical scientific research, but just some basic considerations about like what is, you know, if you're skeptical about reality, you're still engaging in a thought act, and the fact that thought is going on proves existence, right? That's kind of like an a priori construction. So it seems like the difference between materialist and idealistic dialectics is that idealistic, I mean, at least thus far from what I'm reading, uh, that's what it makes me think of, is that materialist dialectics is way more steeped in examining specific features of the world as opposed to making metaphysical assertions about the world as such prior to any kind of scientific investigation of that world, right? And that's kind of what constitutes Marxism as a dogma, right? If Marxism becomes a dogma, it's because it is kind of forming this kind of a priori worldview that tries to shrink empirical reality uh, to its predefined notions of what are the necessary features of the universe, right? So that's why I think that's why if you let this like metaphysical dogma get out of hand, it can turn to and especially in the Stalin period, if you think of like for example like Lysenko, or just what was done to social sciences in the Soviet Union, um, the results of investigations must conform to pre-established dogmas, and if they don't, that causes problems, right? And so that's what happens with like the church, right? If scientists find something out about the universe that's not contained in the metaphysical assertions of scripture, then it's dangerous to that dogma, and can and often did result in repressions. But sorry, I'm just rambling on. I'm kind of running this video by talking about my things. But you know, a priori, a priori, and a posteriori. Uh, that was mean an a posteriori, a question that can only be derived a posteriori means it's an empirical question, and a priori means it's a metaphysical question. And not that metaphysical truths don't exist, right? I would say that like mathematics might be one of those things that's a metaphysical like a priori science, right? It's not like to find out if 2 plus 2, uh, it's a matter of like consistency, I guess, or internal consistency as opposed to an empirical science. But then some people, I think, like other people would say that, mathematics is in fact an empirical science because, its truths are only found out, by experience or whatever, and not just like a consistent application of principles or axioms. I don't know. It's all very confusing, but philosophy is a very deep field, and that's why I'm really excited to read this piece. Um. So where was I at last? Okay, so I read that chart. It says, instead, the features that make Marx's method dialectical are the following. 1. Quote, the concrete is concrete because the concrete is the synthesis of many determinations, hence unity of the diverse, end quote. Marx. The appropriation of the concrete, quote, as a concrete in thought, end quote, has therefore to, quote, grasp the multiplicity of determinations in their unity, end quote. This is the synthetic method according to Hegel. 2. This process leads from the, quote, immediate manifestation of the relations, end quote, to their, quote, interconnection, end quote. 3. The existing concrete has to be appropriated in such a way that, quote, in the positive comprehension of what exists, end quote, lies, quote, at the same time the comprehension of its negation, end quote. These Marxian indications must just localize a theoretical tension field which has to be worked in to interpret Marx's exposition, Darstellung, of the capitalist mode of production, which is structured as a dialectical development of the concept of capital. On the one hand, according to these indications, the dialectical nature of this development lies in the fact that it starts from a historical result which appears as something immediate and arrives at the same result as mediated, thereby denaturalizing the capitalist mode of production and bringing its peculiar structure to light. This development from immediacy to immediateness takes place through a, quote, immanent critique, end quote, of the categories of political economy. See Bachhaus, 1997. That is, a critique that does not originate from their absolute negation, but from their, quote, determinate negation, end quote. See Hegel, 1812-16, which is included in the positive comprehension of these categories. On the other hand, the materialistic character of this development comes from the following features. Thesis 1. The dialectical development fully takes place on a logical level corresponding to the third line of the opposition's chart. Thesis 2. The dialectical development is not closed in on the logical level corresponding to the second line of the opposition's chart. 1 and 2. As a result of the combination of these two features, the dialectical development is not closed in on itself. The first thesis, that the dialectical development fully takes place on a logical level corresponding to the third line of the opposition on the line of the opposition's chart, if expressed in this generic form, can be seen as the common feature of the Neue Marx-Lektura. This thesis implies rejecting the, quote, historicizing, end quote, the, quote, historicizing reading, end quote, of Capital, which reads the critique of political economy as a dialectical, or more generally, conceptual presentation of historical development. See, for example, Ilyenkov, 1971, and Haug, 2003. This historicizing reading dates back to Engels' theorization of Marx's method as a logical historical method. The second thesis, the dialectical development is not closed in on the logical level corresponding to the second line of the opposition's chart, though leads also beyond the logical systematic method developed by the Neue Marx-Lektura and implies a rejection of the so-called germ cell dialectics. Keins en Dialektik. That is, of such interpretations that read the Darstellung as a process of logical deduction of categories from one another. According to such interpretations, Marx identified an initial category from which the whole capitalist mode of production could be deduced, thanks to the driving force of the contradictions inherent to this category. Section 2. On Thesis 1, Logic and History. And the Thesis 1 is, again, the dialectical development fully takes place on a logical level. As to the first thesis, it descends from the nature of Marx's object of inquiry. According to the first line of the opposition's chart, the dialectical development must be the development of the peculiar logic of a peculiar object, and this object is the, quote, specifically capitalist mode of production, end quote, Marx. Hence, the dialectical development of the concept of capital has to grasp the peculiarity of the capitalist mode of production. The object of inquiry is neither as capitalist society in its geographical and historical definiteness, nor capitalism as, quote, a comprehensive socio-historical formation, end quote, in which the capitalist mode of production dominates, but rather the economic structure of capitalist societies, that is, their peculiar mode of provision and socialization of labor. The concept of capital as the object of the dialectical development is therefore a logical object which cannot exist as such in the historical temporality. The object of a historical investigation can only be the different ways in which the capitalist mode of production has established the capitalist mode of production's self and developed in different societies, that is, a history of, quote, capitalisms, end quote. Moreover, in order for dialectical development not to be resolved into a petitio principii, the delimitation of dialectical development's object, its historicization, cannot take place a priori through a historical comparison with other modes of production. If this were the case, it would arbitrarily set as a premise what has instead to be identified, namely the specificity of the capitalist mode of production. The delimitation of the object of development must therefore be a result of development itself. Dialectical development and historical investigation thus have different objects, and correctly positing the object of the latter is only possible after the former. However, a development implies in any case some kind of temporality. In the Grundrisse, Marx also refers to the object of his exposition with the expression, quote, contemporary history, contemporäre Geschichte, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Oh, shit. It's not the end of the quote. Sue me. Sorry, I'm fucking up. However, development implies in any case some kind of temporality. In the Grundrisse, Marx also refers to the object of his exposition with the expression, quote, contemporary history, end quote, of capital, opposing the latter to the history of the constitution of capital and identifying it instead with the, quote, actual system of the mode of production dominated by capital, end quote. It is clear from the context of the passage, which is devoted to the distinction between the historical and logical presuppositions of capital, that Marx, by, quote, contemporary history, end quote, does not refer to the recent history of capital, an interpretation that would lead one to read the critique of political economy as a phase study. Footnote. The German term for, quote, contemporary history, end quote, as a branch of the historical discipline would be Zeitgeschichte, or Zeitgenössische Geschichte. But the concept itself was not yet firmly established in Marx's time. End footnote. A simple reflection on the etymology of the adjective contemporare from the Latin cum tempus, which literally corresponds to the Greek synchronos, suggests the meaning to be given to the expression. It does not refer to a, quote, mode of historicity, end quote, as Wolfgang Fritz Haug claims, but to a mode of temporality, namely synchronicity. The word, quote, history, end quote, expresses here a peculiar way of dealing with this mode of temporality. To write the history of a synchrony means to unfold this synchrony as a development, to unfold the internal temporality of a logical object. This is exactly the meaning of the expression, quote, dialectical development, end quote. The dialectical development of the concept of capital is thus the unfolding of its logical temporality. This unfolding takes the form of a succession of categorical transitions. These do not correspond to events that have occurred or may occur in the course of the historical development of capitalist relations, or to logical connections constantly presupposed by the very existence of those relations. The only history that is the object of dialectical development is the history that, quote, goes on stage every day before our eyes, end quote. Not Marx, not a history made up of successive unique events, then, but a set of elements that always reproduces itself according to the same structured order. To read the development of economic categories in capital as if the development of economic categories in capital corresponded to a development in historical temporality, as Marx explicitly states, not only wrong but, quote, unfeasible, end quote. Marx Grundrisse, because, quote, the simplest economic category, can never exist other than as an abstract, one-sided perspective on an already given concrete living whole, end quote. The categories that follow one another in capital thus express abstract moments of a whole assumed as given. Their abstract character derives from the fact that they are indeed forms of expression of that whole, but they can only ever express it in a unilateral way. The whole, on the other hand, is to be regarded as concrete insofar as it expresses these moments that belong together in their unity. In the course of development, the concept of capital must express precisely those specific connections between the different phenomenal forms of capitalist relations without which none of these phenomenal forms could arise. In short, it must express the structure of capitalist relations. It is a dialectical concept insofar as it possesses an internal temporality in the course of which different economic categories gradually reveal themselves to be its abstract moments. A first limitation of the dialectical method thus consists in the fact that the validity of dialectics must be limited to the logical level. Dialectical development can only be defined as materialist if, as dialectical, it is intended to discover the inner structure and therefore the specificity of an object of research taken as having become and not to explain the historical becoming of this object. Transferring the logically necessary character of category development to the level of historical development inevitably leads to determinist philosophies of history. A dialectical method that wants to distinguish itself from an idealization of history can provide a key to understanding historical becoming only insofar as it allows us to identify the logical presuppositions for the existence of the becoming, and thus allows us, in a second step that already lies beyond the dialectical method itself, to identify also which passages of historical development were the decisive passages for it to result in what it actually resulted in. But explaining how and why those historical passages occurred remains an open task to be solved not with the tools of dialectics, but with those of historiography. I'm going to repeat that again because that seems super important. That's the tools of dialectics. The movement from dialectics, like methodological questions, to like empirical questions of history. I'm going to repeat it. But explaining how and why those historical passages occurred remains an open task to be solved not with the tools of dialectics, but with those of historiography. Section 3. From Thesis 1. Let's see if we can go back to the theses. So we just, I'm a repetition guy. Thesis 1, again, is the dialectical development fully takes place on a logical level. Thesis 2, the dialectical development is not closed in on the logical level. So let's go back to the section. From Thesis 1 to Thesis 2, Logic and Dialectics. If the task of the dialectical exposition, Darstellung, is defined as above, it is clear that the task of the dialectical exposition, Darstellung, cannot be a mere presentation of the results of the inquiry, Forschung. Rather, the exposition is to be understood as a new work on the material from the inquiry, from which new information about this material not accessible before the exposition is to emerge. In other words, the aim of the exposition is not simply to express the, quote, peculiar logic of the peculiar object, end quote, but also to discover this logic. The argument about the logical character of the object of exposition, however, has often led to a misunderstanding, calling the method followed by Marx a, quote, logical method, end quote, or a, quote, logical systematic method, end quote. C.E.G. Schmidt, 1970, 1970, Reichelt, 1970, 1972, Schmidt, 1971, 1977, Elba, 2010, Wolf, 2008. However, the fact that the object of the exposition is a logical object does not mean that the method should be defined in the same way. The only reason why it seems natural to define the method of exposition as logical is that logical rather than historical is the order in which the categories are exposed. But defining the method of exposition on the basis of the order in which the categories are exposed is tantamount to asserting that the peculiar logic of the peculiar object is already determined before the exposition, and that it is only a matter of following the criterion provided by this logic, without losing the thread that links the various categories together from the outset. The definition of the method should in fact refer to how this, quote, logic of the thing itself, end quote, is to be discovered. In this sense, the most appropriate adjective remains, quote, dialectical, end quote. This is not merely a matter of definition, because not distinguishing between the dialecticality of the method and the logicality of the object easily leads to interpreting the dialectical development of the concept of capital as a, quote, circle screwed on itself, end quote. Hegel, in the manner of Hegelian absolute knowledge. This is precisely what has often been the case in the Neue Marx-Lektura, whose logical, systematic conception of method implies a, quote, germ cell dialectics, end quote, whereby the internal logic of the concept of capital is to be determined by following this logic in its own development. The concrete, that is, the multiplicity of determinations in their unity, would then already be contained in nous in the initial category as an abstract determination, and would have to be revealed by following precisely the logical development of this category. Dialectical development would then become the self-development of the logic of the concept of capital. But such a self-development presupposes the identity of subject, object, and method of development is realized in the Hegelian concept. Identifying the logical object and dialectical method of Marx's exposition therefore means asserting the identity of subject and object for it too, and thus interpreting it in terms of Hegelian absolute knowledge, self-knowledge of the object of knowledge, knowledge without presuppositions insofar as it is able to transcend its own posited character and become knowledge a priori. Such an interpretation contradicts the second thesis advanced here on the materialist character of Marx's exposition. Section 4, on Thesis 2, Dialectics and Empirics. So, and that again corresponds to the thing I was saying before about a priori versus a posteriori. Sorry, I get them. Sometimes I say a priori and a priori, but they're the same words. So again, Thesis 1. The dialectical development fully takes place on a logical level. Thesis 2. The dialectical development is not closed in on the logical level. 1 and 2. As a result of the combination of these two features, the dialectical development is not closed in on itself. I guess you guys know this if you've listened to any things, but I'm kind of a repetition guy. Like, I try to fill in, like, when I'm reading these things aloud, because I listen to these things for my own purposes, and when I read these aloud, when things say, like, it or he or things like that, I try to follow what that pronoun, the particular the particular word or person that pronoun is standing in for. Because sometimes when you see it too many times, you're like, what was that it in reference to again? What is that it specifically referring to again? So that's why I keep having to go back and reread these theses, because I want to remember what's actually being discussed. I want to keep the thread to the extent that I can. Maybe that's annoying to listen to, but for me, it's helpful, and hopefully, it's helpful to someone else. As to the second thesis, it could be read as a restrictive clause to the first one. Although the dialectical development of the concept of capital takes place entirely on the logical level, the dialectical development of the concept of capital is not closed in on logicality. Hence, the dialectical development of the concept of capital is not closed in on itself. It is well known that Marx's exposition does not begin with a concept, but with a certain result of historical development presented, quote, in the form in which it manifests itself, end quote. Marx, that is, the commodity as the form in which the, quote, wealth of the societies in which the capitalist mode of production dominates manifests itself, end quote. Marx's initial category thus has the character of an empirical a posteriori category. This is not to be understood, however, in a positivistic sense, for this category is not posited either as a concept or as a positive description of a phenomenon. Rather, it corresponds to the way in which a social phenomenon is perceived by the subjects who experience it. The empirics with which Marx begins his work are thus the economic relations as they manifest themselves in the eyes of the subjects involved and theorists of these relations. The categories of political economy thus represent for Marx the self-understanding of bourgeois societies. The key that sets the Marxian dialectical development in motion is the problematization of the empirical experience expressed by the economic categories. See Establette and Machery, 1965. There are two authors that are in Lire la Capitale, Reading Capital. That's usually there's the longer version of it, not the shortened version, that just has the piece by Althusser and Balibar. I believe that's all this short section has. Short one has. I haven't read these, but I know that these are authors. These are French authors that are featured in that book, Reading Capital. So let me repeat that sentence. The key that sets the Marxian dialectical development in motion is the problematization of the empirical experience expressed by the economic categories, that is, the questions, how is this experience possible? Under what conditions can the economic phenomenon manifest itself as it does? The point is that once a given experiential datum has been posited as an initial category, the entire chain of categorical transitions cannot be generated from its problematization as an absolute logical development that is independent of further historical empirical presuppositions, so that it would be able to transcend its a posteriori character by coming at the end of the process to pose as the result of its autonomous movement the same empirical datum from which it started. Such a transformation of an a posteriori cognitive process into an a priori categorical development would again presuppose the identity of subject and object of the development. See Coletti, 1969. Footnote, in Hegel, only insofar as, quote, the pure concept has itself as the pure concept's object, end quote, is the pure concept able to, quote, overcome the pure concept's own position as content and object, end quote. Hegel. On the contrary, the materialistic character of end footnote. On the contrary, the materialistic character of Marxian dialectical development resides in the fact that not only the beginning of the dialectical movement, but each of the dialectical movement's fundamental steps is characterized by an assimilation and transformation of historical empirical data, without which the dialectical development of the categories could not advance. For instance, the transition from the sphere of simple circulation to that of capital could not take place without introducing into the exposition from the outside wage labor, the purchasability of labor power as a commodity. See Wolff, 2006. The cognitive process, therefore, never transcends the cognitive process's a posteriori character. On the contrary, as the dialectical development proceeds, the exposition is charged with ever new empirical presuppositions. The fact that the exposition develops entirely at the level of the logical temporality of the exposition's object does not therefore mean that the historical dimension is expelled from Marx's method. It is only the historical temporality that is expelled. Instead, the historical dimension constantly enters the exposition in the form of empirics, that is, in the form of the results of the historical development taken in their phenomenal form. Only in this way can Marxian exposition achieve Marxian exposition's scientific aims. In fact, the need to go beyond the empiricist point of view and the impossibility of a categorical development independent of empirics both originate in the new kind of problem that Marx finds himself facing and that informs the specific epistemological terrain of the critique of political economy. This problem is that it is not enough in order to grasp capitalist relations in their inner structure to emancipate oneself from ideology subjectively understood and observe the empirical world, quote, as it offers itself to anyone who approaches the empirical world without preconceived idealistic reverie, end quote, Engels. Because the ideological content of the categories of political economy itself originates from the social objectivity of capitalist relations. Footnote: the positivist conception of materialism in Engels clearly played a fundamental role in Engels' interpretation of Marx's exposition as a conceptual reflection of historical becoming. End footnote. Marx refers to this with the expression, quote, real mystification, end quote. In their phenomenal form, the relations defined by the categories of value, money, commodity, labor, and capital do not manifest themselves in their reciprocal connections. On the contrary, as they objectively appear in the empirical experience, they do not even present themselves as relations, but rather as, quote, things, end quote. What is false in the categories of political economy, but rather as, quote, things. Sorry, there's a footnote. Regarding this objective appearance, it is essential to embrace Bellofiore's distinction between fetish character and fetishism. End footnote. Where am I? Well, let me repeat that last sentence, sorry. In their phenomenal form, the relations defined by the categories of value, money, commodity, labor, and capital do not manifest themselves in their reciprocal connection. On the contrary, as they objectively appear in the empirical experience, they do not even present themselves as relations, but rather as, quote, things, end quote. What is false in the categories of political economy is thus itself part of the truth of capitalist relations. Marx therefore cannot simply set aside the errors of political economy and turn directly to pure, quote, facts, end quote, because the truth of capitalist relations can only be understood by understanding the falsity of the categories of political economy. This is why the exposition of the capitalist mode of production and the critique of political economy are inseparably linked in Marx. If this is the problem that Marx has to face, the rejection of empiricism and the adoption of a dialectical procedure is an obligatory choice. On the other hand, however, through dialectical exposition, Marx must trace the categories of political economy taken as, quote, socially valid, hence objective forms of thought, end quote, back to those specific, quote, forms of human life, end quote, on the basis of which the post festum development of those objective forms of thought was possible. That is, Marx must identify the concrete and historically determined presuppositions of those objective forms of thought that bear no trace of those historically determined presuppositions, but instead present themselves as universal. It is only in this way that Marx can historicize the categories of political economy in an imminent way. The fundamental question that must guide Marx's exposition is, therefore, what results of historical development does the empirical existence of the objective forms of thought corresponding to the categories of political economy presuppose? This question could not be answered by a self-contained logical development whose course is independent of experiential data, because on the one hand, the categories that are to be gradually posited as determinations of the concept of capital must be objective forms of thought that can be detected as results of historical development. On the one hand, these categories must be developed by relating each of these categories to each category's own historically determined presuppositions, which are themselves empirical data resulting from historical development. If the entire categorical development was already contained in the initial category, this would mean that the capitalist relations and the capitalist relations inner structure would already be reflected in this first form of thought, though they would be reflected there in an unconscious and unexpressed way and would have to be brought to expression by developing the contradictions inherent in this category. But this, quote, germ cell dialectics, end quote, denies exactly the problem that makes a dialectical procedure necessary, the fact that capitalist relations, as capitalist relations objectively manifest themselves, and thus primarily as capitalist relations manifest themselves in the categories of political economy, are not relations in their inner structure. In order to grasp capitalist relations inner structure, it is necessary to go beyond the categories that express these capitalist relations and to identify these capitalist relations' historically determined presuppositions. The achievement of the aims of the critique of political economy thus implies the effective recourse to empirical inquiry, which in itself has nothing to do with dialectical development. Inquiry and exposition are therefore to be considered as two epistemologically and methodologically distinct moments, but not chronologically opposed to each other, since the results of inquiry must constantly enter the exposition as extraneous elements that it could not produce on its own in order to become an integral part of it. Hence, then, is a second limitation of the dialectical method in Marx. The dialectical character of the method must be limited to the mode of exposition. 1 second. Section 5. An immanent critique of the empirical. After having theoretically defined how a materialistic dialectical method should look, the problem is to understand how dialectical development can practically assimilate the contents of experience, that is, to identify a principle of reading that responds to both aforementioned claims. Such a principle can consist in reading the dialectical development as an a posteriori reconstruction of the conditions of existence for what is given. An analysis of the Marxian method at work shows that such a formulation can be applied both to the relation of the whole development to the entire research object and to the single conceptual steps of the development. On the one hand, the dialectical development of the concept of capital as a whole reconstructs the totality of the conclusions of existence of specifically capitalist relations. On the other hand, this development consists in a chain of categorical transitions in which each category expresses the conditions of existence of the relations expressed by the preceding categories. In fact, as argued above, the dialectical exposition of the capitalist mode of production has the task of reconstructing that specific mode of labor provision and socialization that must underlie bourgeois societies in order for capitalist social relations to manifest themselves as they de facto do. This means not only that the mode of manifestation of capitalist relations is assumed as given in the exposition, and therefore that the development as a whole takes place a posteriori, but also that this a posteriori character is not transcended at any stage of the dialectical development, since every category that arises in the course of development is assumed as the objective given phenomenal form of capitalist relations. In other words, each category corresponds to an experiential content found by Marx, quote, at the surface of the bourgeois world, end quote, and expressed in the economist's theories. The task that the categorical development has to fulfill is therefore not to reduce one category from the other, but rather to establish implication relations between them and consequently between the contents of experience that the categories express. Hence, in transition from one category to the other category, the content of the other category has not to be deduced from the content of the former category. Just as the former category, it rather expresses a content of experience found at the, quote, surface of the bourgeois world, end quote. The category must, however, turn out to be that particular content of experience without which the content of the former category could not manifest the content of the former category's self in the way it does in that category. In the transition, the empirical immediateness of the one category vanishes, because this one category turns out to be necessarily mediated by the other category. What comes to light in this way is the specific immediateness of the manifold manifestations of capitalist relations. That is, the specific connections between the phenomenon without which each phenomenon could not be given, in short, the structure of the capitalist relations. If the term, quote, empirical, end quote, is understood to mean not only the immediate empirical data, but also the objective forms of thought crystallized in the categories of political economy, then the dialectical development of the concept of capital could be appropriately called an immanent critique of the empirical. A critique of the empirical because it denies the immediacy of the various relations expressed by the categories of political economy: universal commodity exchange, value, monetary circulation, labor, capital, credit, and so on. That is, a critique of the empirical denies the way in which these relations objectively manifest themselves in empirics. Immanent critique of the empirical because the way in which bourgeois relations manifest themselves as empirically is critiqued through the establishment of logically necessary connections between different experiential contents, which thus turn out to be phenomenal forms of a whole. The immediacy of a given empirically posited content is thus always denied by showing another empirically posited content as its condition of existence. This interpretation framework provides a solution to the long-standing question about the criteria for selecting the empirical material to be included in the exposition of the capitalistic mode of production. E.g. see Luperini, 1974. Indeed, in order to expose the specifically capitalist mode of production, Marx has to outline exclusively the invariant structure of this mode of production, logically implicated by the way in which the capitalist relations of production, in which the capitalist relations manifest themselves in bourgeois society. For this reason, the dialectical exposition has to be restricted to the necessary conditions of existence of these relations. Defining the conditions of possibility for specifically capitalistic socialization means at the same time defining the conditions of possibility for specifically capitalistic socialization means at the same time defining capitalistic socialization's whole range of possibilities. In fact, according to the proposed reading principle, a specific empirical occurrence, such as the availability of a labor force as a commodity or the existence of a monetary circulation, turns out to be a part of the structure of the capitalist mode of production and to play a significant role within the capitalist mode of production, because it happens to be that specific circumstance that fulfills a specific claim of the exposition, and therefore it turns out to be a necessary condition for the existence of the research object. The integration of an empirical fact, such as the availability of labor power as a commodity, into the dialectical development produces information that could not have been found through empirical analysis alone. For instance, the impossibility of abolishing the wage-labor relationship without undermining universal commodity exchange. Footnote: This kind of information has a crucial political importance and allows the critique of political economy to be a fundamental instrument of revolutionary change of social relations, even though the characterization of the critique of political economy's object made at the beginning makes it clear that it cannot be directly used as if it were a political work. Various intermediate steps are required, but it is on the basis of such knowledge of structural connections that Marx can, for example, reject Proudhon's political proposals and brand them as utopian. In fact, the critique of political economy cannot provide a scientific political theory, yet it can give political thought the possibility of a grounding in scientific knowledge, that is, knowledge of social objectivity. End footnote. Where's the footnote again? Other circumstances that can be empirically found alongside it, such as the dominance of factory work or the existence of a gold standard, shall be interpreted either as historical figures of the structural forms, see Finesci 2008, or simply as strictly contingent convergences, as long as they do not play a specific role in the dialectical development. Hence, which results of empirical inquiry are to be integrated into the dialectical exposition, and which role they have to play within it can be only found out in the course of the expression itself. It is therefore through the dialectical exposition that the object of the exposition itself is outlined. This does not mean that the exposition follows a logical path of its own, independent from the inquiry. First, because the logical connection between two categories could not be established if the connection between the actual social relations expressed in these categories were not already a factual result of historical development, and second, because the dialectical movement from one category to the other category could not take place without effective recourse to factual data that could in no way be deduced from the first category. The imminent development of the first category in itself leads only to the precondition. The imminent development of the first category in itself leads only to the recognition of the first category's logical non-self-sufficiency. But the elements necessary to overcome this category are not contained in this first category, and cannot therefore be logically developed from the first category. So I'm guessing what's that saying is that, I don't know, the totality, the concrete totality of capitalist social relations cannot be deduced from basic considerations of what a commodity is. And I'm not sure I'm trying to think of someone who, for instance, like a commodity or like use value or value or any of these, well, I guess use value and value are the categories within a category. I don't fucking know. But I suppose that, like, if you tried to deduce, I don't know, absolute surplus value and the striving for absolute surplus value from the commodity, you're constructing kind of like an a priori development of the categories as opposed to an a posteriori development. Sorry, I'm just thinking out loud. I'm thinking of how Marx says, like, you know, looking at this work, you can have the idea that this is just kind of like an a priori, like a priori deduction of categories from one another, based simply on like logical considerations. But that's only after having subsumed like the empirical detail and the complexity of capitalism, I guess, in its different manifestations, and then reconstructing that empirical detail acquired in the phase of inquiry into a coherent presentation of that whole, right? I don't know. It seems like you can only kind of like, you can say that like while it seems like you can definitely say, for instance, how like relative surplus value production and the commodity form um what's the word, are consistent with one another, right? But that's saying that consistency is not really like, you can't like deduce just like, okay, what's a commodity? Okay, so absolute surplus value or relative surplus value, right? You have to do more empirical steps to look at the actual capitalist economic process and the historical preconditions for it, and not just like the logical. Uh, sorry, I'm just thinking out loud. Anyway, basically, you can't logically derive wage labor simply from considerations about the commodity, I guess is what is being said. I'm not sure, but or any of the more empirical things like the especially something like the falling rate of profit. If the degree to whether or not you accept that theory can't be derived just from the logical comprehension of uh, a commodity's the preconditions of the commodity form, I guess. I don't know. Section 6, Conclusions. The above interpretive principle represents a solution to the problem of the theoretical tension field, quote, dialectics / materialism, end quote. The coordinates of this tension field were found at the beginning by referring to Marx's meta-theoretical self-understanding. However, it can be definitely excluded that Marx had sufficient awareness of the epistemological status of his dialectical exposition. This is proven not only by the ambiguity of several methodological statements, such as the aforementioned metaphor of inversion, but also by the fact that in some passages of Marx's critique of political economy, Marx commits theoretical errors evidently due to inadequate meta-theoretical awareness. In this respect, it is significant that the aspects of the theory of capital that have proved weakest, such as the transformation of values into prices, the status assigned to the law of the tendential fall of the rate of profit, or the failure to overcome metalism in the theory of money, are also those in which Marx's procedure does not allow itself to be read according to the principle of the immanent critique of the empirical. Particularly eloquent is also the fact that in Marx persists at times a theory of truth as unveiling, such that to identify capitalist relations in capitalist relations' own interconnection would be equivalent to finding the essence behind the phenomenon. To understand that this theory of truth is not compatible with the materialist dialectics interpreted as proposed here, it is sufficient to ask what the materialistic character of this dialectical procedure consists of. Quote, materialism, end quote, obviously does not refer to a materialistic reductionism in the mechanistic sense, since on the contrary, in the course of the dialectical exposition, Marx goes so far as to show how factors such as money, commodity, and capital, which in political economy and in the common consciousness are considered as material things, are in fact the reification of social relations. Nor does, quote, materialism, end quote, refer to the materiality of economic interests as opposed to ideal motivations, as one might think by applying to the critique of political economy a cliché that is at most valid in other areas of Marxist theory. In fact, in the critique of the reification of social relations, subjective economic interests are as irrelevant as ideal motivations. What matters is rather the social objectivity of the mechanisms of reproduction of capitalist relations, that is, the mechanisms of reproduction of capitalist relations, ability to impose. In fact, in the critique of the reification of social relations, subjective economic interests are as irrelevant as ideal motivations. What matters is rather the social objectivity of the mechanisms of reproduction of capitalist relations. That is, the capitalist relations' ability to impose themselves on the backs of the subjects involved in spite of their subjective interests. The material character of the dialectical procedure, rather, is to be found in its ability to go beyond the immediacy of phenomenon without, however, going beyond the phenomena themselves, but rather rising above them to grasp them in their mutual mediation. The materialism/idealism opposition, which, particularly by the proponents of so-called Hegelo-Marxism, has often been seen as an obsolete and empty formula, not without some reason, finds here a precise meaning again. Although a materialist dialectics and an idealist dialectics necessarily have in common the rejection of empiricism, an idealist dialectics is one that rejects the empirical world as well, considering the empirical world as a concealment of an essence that lies behind the empirical world, and claiming therefore to reach an absolute knowledge, literally meaning a knowledge that is independent from the experience, for which it could properly be called metaphysics. A materialist dialectics is a dialectics that remains tied to the empirical world and carries out an immanent critique of the empirical world. I like that. A materialist dialectics is a dialectics that remains tied to the empirical world and carries out an immanent critique of the empirical world. Thanks for listening.